Halfway through the third book of A Song of Ice and Fire, Lord Tywin Lannister commissions two Valyrian steel swords intended to be crucial to the shining legacy of House Lannister. Blades forged of this mythical metal are exceedingly rare, as the knowledge used to create such a material were lost in the doom of Valyria. Tywin acquiring not one but two of these blades invokes a level of status and power for his house, not seen for hundreds of years, not since the Dragon Kings once ruled Westeros. House Targaryen was one of very few families to flee Valyria before the Doom. They settled on the island of Dragonstone, bringing with them dragons and artifacts from the Old Empire. Chief among these treasures were two blades that would become known as the symbols of the ruling house of Westeros. The first of these, Blackfire, was typically passed from king to king. Its use was primarily ceremonial and intended to signal the legitimacy of the monarch. I've got a video on Blackfire that you can check out in the cards, so check that out after this video. The second blade stands in opposition to the first in a variety of ways. Its history is not as a symbolic ornament, but rather as a weapon that thirsts for violence and for blood. This blade is known as Dark Sister. Similarly to Blackfire, it was also lost some time prior to the main series of books. However, there are strong hints pointing towards the role in the future of the story and where exactly it might be today. Today we'll be examining the sword's history and theorizing about its current location and future role in the Winds of Winter. And before we get into all of it, be sure to subscribe and like the video if you enjoy it. I make all kinds of A Song of Ice and Fire, history, and theory content, and I really appreciate any support. Back to the video. Similarly to Blackfire, Dark Sister's original wielder is the individual most associated with the blade, Visenya Targaryen, the sister and bride of Aegon the Conqueror. Of the three siblings that laid claim to Westeros, Visenya was always considered the most martially gifted and the most warlike. And according to the in-universe history books, Dark Sister does predate Visenya, which is news to me. I'd previously believed that the sword was named for her and was created for her. It was supposedly forged for a woman's hand, whoever that woman was, as it is more slender than a typical sword, as tends to be the fashion for swords for women in Westeros, at least if you're not Brienne. Visenya wielded this blade many times, both before, during, and after the conquest. On two separate occasions, she defended both herself and the king from Dornish assassins prior to the invention of the Kingsguard. After the second of these attempts, she even used the blade against her own brother. She reached out and slashed his cheek quicker than his guards could react, in order to demonstrate to the king that he needed more skilled protectors by his side. Visenya retained Dark Sister for 2.5 decades following the conquest of Aegon. In the year 25 AC, she bestowed this legendary sword upon her son, Prince Maegor Targaryen, who was 13 years old at the time. Maegor wielded this sword deftly, as all knew of his prowess on the battlefield. That is, until the year 37 AC. Aenys Targaryen, Maegor's elder half-brother, ascended to the throne and gave Maegor the sword Blackfire as a gesture of goodwill, along with the title of Hand of the King. Maegor then mounted Dark Sister on his mantle, where it sat for the next 7 years. Notably, this is the only time in Targaryen history where one individual owned both Dark Sister and Blackfire and had wielded both in combat. Aenys did not last long as king, and Maegor soon succeeded his brother on the Iron Throne. However, in the year 44 AC, his mother, Visenya, passed away, dying of natural causes on Dragonstone. Immediately after this happened, several hostages who were being held in the island fortress fled, including the young Jaehaerys Targaryen. On his way out, Baby J stole his uncle Maegor's spare Valyrian steel sword. 4 years later, when Jaehaerys announced his claim to the Iron Throne, he did so wielding Dark Sister at Storm's End with his uncle behind him. Maegor then died via betrayal or suicide or some unknown third thing, and soon Jaehaerys' long reign began. During this long reign, Dark Sister had two famed wielders, neither of which were the king himself. The first was Balon the Brave, Jaehaerys' third son, but second to survive to adulthood. Balon the Brave is the father of King Viserys and Prince Daemon, and we know him for a number of reasons from House of the Dragon. He was known as a fierce warrior, and the only time we ever hear of him using this blade was in a vengeful rage, cutting down the Myrish exiles that had slain his elder brother on the Isle of Tarth. Balon soon kicked the bucket himself, leaving Dark Sister in the hands of a new wielder. We now fully arrive at the time period covered by House of the Dragon. As you may know, during this era, Dark Sister is wielded by the one and only rogue prince, Daemon Targaryen. This sword was not simply passed down from his father Balon to the son, but rather was granted to Daemon by his grandfather, King Jaehaerys himself, on account of the young prince's prowess in combat. Out of all of its wielders so far, Daemon bears the closest resemblance to Visenya Targaryen, being an important influence on the crown for several monarchs despite never holding that power for himself. It's from Daemon that we get a bit of characterization for the sword itself. Daemon tells Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, that Dark Sister was made for nobler tasks than slaughtering sheep. She has a thirst for blood. Well, this is very likely a case of just Daemon being edgy and trying to dodge his responsibilities in the Vale. The idea of these magical blades having wills of their own is pretty interesting. We know that Valyrian steel is magical. We don't really know the extent of that magic beyond simply being a sharper sword. Perhaps some of the blood magic woven into the metal by ancient Valyrians could involve fusing some sort of will or soul into the sword itself. The alternative possibility is that I'm just a DM who gives their players in D&D too many sentient magical items to try to have them get themselves killed with. We know of a couple times during which Daemon used this blade. He decapitated the crab feeder during the war in the Stepstones, and later used it in a tourney to fight against Sir Criston Cole, and the Rogue Prince ended up losing this fight. Using a Valyrian steel blade in a tourney is a lot like showing up to paintball with a shotgun, so this is a rare occasion where I'm happy that Criston Cole won. Daemon also makes use of this blade during the Dance of the Dragons, the civil war that engulfs this entire generation of Targaryens. If you don't want mega spoilers for the best moment of House of the Dragon, you should skip ahead to the next timestamp. Daemon only uses Dark Sister once that we know of during the Dance of the Dragons, but he very much made it count. During the battle above the God's Eye, Daemon leapt from his dragon Caraxes' saddle, plunging Dark Sister into the one good eye of his nephew, Prince Aemon Targaryen. Both men perished along with their dragons, and when Aemon's bones were recovered years later, Dark Sister was found, still impaled in his empty eye socket. We have very few details on the next wielder of Dark Sister, as this era will likely be covered in Fire and Blood Part 2, should it ever be published. Prince Aemon the Dragonknight took up this legendary blade during his spectacular tenure on the Kingsguard. We know of a number of his great deeds in general, but unfortunately Dark Sister itself is not specifically mentioned in any of them. This brings us to the final wielder of Dark Sister in the historical record, Bloodraven. Brynden Rivers, also called Bloodraven, was one of the bastards of King Aegon IV Targaryen. Aegon IV legitimized all of his bastards on his deathbed and bestowed Blackfire upon one of them, Daemon Rivers. Bloodraven was given Dark Sister, and this marked the third time that these Targaryen swords ended up on opposing sides of a conflict. We know that Bloodraven fought a duel against his half-brother, Bittersteel, at the Battle of the Redgrass Field, likely using this legendary blade. After that point, we mostly hear of Bloodraven as a spy master, puppet master, and archer, rather than a melee combatant. That is, until the beginning of the reign of King Aegon V. Aegon had had enough of his uncle's nefarious tactics, and banished Bloodraven to the Night's Watch. Brynden rode north and eventually became Lord Commander of this ancient organization before mysteriously vanishing north of the Wall. Shockingly, Bloodraven reappears in the main series. He's plugged into a bunch of trees north of the Wall, where he's summoned Bran Stark in order to tutor the boy in the ways of the Weirwood. However, whether or not he currently possesses Dark Sister is still a bit up in the air. According to a very semi-canon source, Martin said that Bloodraven did take the magic sword north with him. This was allegedly a question asked to the author at a con, which was later picked up and commented on by the History of Westeros podcast. While I normally wouldn't mention an offhand comment or tweet like this, given the fact that the History of Westeros has pretty direct communications with Martin, I think this semi confirmation is worth considering. Even without it, I do think it's very likely that he did take Dark Sister North with him, and it could come back into play in the story via being in that cave with Bran and Bloodraven and all of his companions at the present moment in the story at the end of A Dance with Dragons. Seeing as Bran is already in Bloodraven's cave, it seems to be a quite likely and convenient location for the long lost sword to finally re enter the main story. We know that the events surrounding Hold the Door from the television adaptation were a direct note from George R. Martin, so one can presume that at some point during the Winds of Winter, the others will attack the cave and force Bran and his companions to flee. At that point, Mira seems to be the most likely candidate to wield Dark Sister. She's the only warrior left out of Bran's group, especially after Hodor was left behind. What's more, she is Jojen's sister, and given the fact that Jojen was likely eaten by Bran and Bloodraven via the Jojen paste incident, which I'll link to theory in the cards, it does seem like she'd be in a very dark place, and that very much could line up with both the name of the swords and the generally more kind of edgy or just generally downtrodden wielders of Dark Sister in the past, barring Aemon the Dragon Knight, who, as far as we know, was pretty chill and upbeat. That being said, I don't believe that Mira is the final destination for Dark Sister's purpose in the story. I see two distinct possibilities as to who may wield or bear this Valyrian steel sword in the wars to come, in the winds of winter, and a dream of spring. Arya Stark is the first and most obvious candidate. In a meta sense, it seems as though this sword was made for her, and I've always thought so in terms of the overall scope of the story as a whole. She's someone who's made it on their own and is known as a skilled warrior, similar to many of the wielders of Dark Sister in the past. And additionally, if anybody in the Stark family was to be a Dark Sister, it's definitely Arya. Additionally, this sword does resemble Arya's current sword, Needle, in its description, as both are described as thin and meant to be a lighter hand, essentially. When I was reading these books for the first time, I did think that Dark Sister was intended by Gurm to end up in Arya's hands, potentially fighting the White Walkers, if I could speak, but not killing the Night King because he doesn't exist in the book canon as far as we know, and that will not happen. That won't happen. It better not happen. The other candidate is someone I haven't seen often brought up as a wielder of Dark Sister, that being Daenerys Targaryen. As far as I'm aware, no one has brought up this possibility, and understandably so. Despite Daenerys being extremely dangerous on account of her dragons, she's never really wielded a weapon herself. However, I still think that someone giving Daenerys Dark Sister could make a lot of sense for her arc thematically. To start, we know that she's a claimant to the Iron Throne who is likely to be battling against another Targaryen claimant. As previously mentioned, Dark Sister and Blackfyre have a storied history of being on opposite sides of Targaryen conflicts. Blackfyre is often the sword strictly used for ceremonial purposes, but perhaps Dany and Aegon will reverse that tradition, as they seem to be doing with many Targaryen traditions. It's also worth noting that I think the show overall has the correct order of events in terms of the final plot lines of the story. That being that Daenerys will end up aiding and dealing with the White Walker threat before making her final advances in taking the Iron Throne. I think that, perhaps as a reward for her service during the battles for the Dawn, she might be granted Dark Sister by Bran, by Arya, or perhaps even Jon Snow. So in a sense, both Arya and Daenerys could end up wielding this sword at different points in the story. In my video on Blackfyre, I have an entire section dedicated to what Blackfyre represents to the Aegon cause and wins. It's a source of much needed legitimacy and adds to the idea that Aegon's cause will be heralded by the people as just and as righteous. Dark Sister, on the other hand, fits perfectly with the image that Daenerys is likely to cultivate with the citizens of Westeros. This tyrant from the east arriving on their land, backed by Dothraki, three dragons, and potentially carrying the sword wielded by so many dark figures from the Targaryen past. The only other candidate for me that really comes to mind as a dark sister in the story is Asha, but even then, I don't really think thematically it fits for her arc to be given this sword. I'm sure there are other candidates to wield this mythical sword, and I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments below. Regardless of who wields it, it seems like Dark Sister is going to play a pivotal role in the Wars for the Dawn because of its location and proximity to the White Walker plot. Overall, it seems like it'll be a very important resource for those who are attempting to end the Long Night and bring about the end of the others as a whole. So, what do you all think of Dark Sister and of this video? I was excited to release it. It was a long time coming because Blackfyre was months and months ago, and I'm quite excited to see what people think, at least of the Daenerys part of this video, as I haven't really seen it be suggested before, and I think it does very much make sense thematically. What do you think of that or anything else in the video? And be sure to like and subscribe while you're down commenting. I'd really appreciate that and any support on the video, all those typical YouTube things that I'm very bad at plugging. I appreciate any support, really. Thank you all for watching, and I would appreciate any suggestions for future videos in the comments as well, and I will see you all in the near future. Goodbye!